When my uncle died, I was the only one in the family who could return for the funeral. I'd been living in France for years, half forgetting the rhythms of Saint Louis, Senegal, the heat that stuck to your skin like wet cloth, the sharp scent of salt and river mud that trailed every breeze. When the call came, I knew I couldn't avoid it. Family had a way of pulling you back, whether you were ready or not. The plane touched down in Dakar under a heavy sky, the sun a pale, swollen disk fighting its way through the haze. I rode the long road north in silence, watching the flat stretches of thorn trees and dry earth give way to the wetlands and the brackish estuaries near Saint Louis. When I finally crossed the old Faidherbe bridge, the city felt like a fossil. The French colonial buildings faded but still proud, their shutters warped from years of ocean winds, their balconies clinging to rusting wrought iron. My uncle had lived his entire life on the Langue de Barbarie, the thin strip of sand that separated the Atlantic from the Senegal River. His house had been close to the shore, where the wind never stopped humming against the walls, and the waves echoed through the streets long after dark. It was a place both beautiful and heavy, the kind of beauty that masks something older and less forgiving. The funeral was held the next morning, under a sky swollen with rain clouds. We walked the body through the streets on foot, as was the custom, accompanied by a procession of neighbours and family. The men moved in silence, the women trailing in mournful prayer, and the city seemed to shrink around us as we approached Cimetière de Gaïndar. The cemetery lay on the far northern end of the Langue, pressed between the restless Atlantic and the mouth of the Senegal River. A narrow wall of crumbling concrete separated the dead from the sea, but the waves often had their way with it. Salt had eaten into the stone, and the air was thick with it. The graves stood in tight, uneven rows, the earth soft and shifting underfoot, as though the sea and the sand were always conspiring to pull the dead back into the ground. The place was old, older than anyone could say for sure. Crosses and slabs leaned at odd angles, eroded names barely legible, and the few marble headstones stood out like foreign intruders among the rough concrete tombs. Seaweed sometimes washed all the way into the cemetery, leaving pale, brittle strands draped across the stones like tattered shrouds. The wind never stopped. It whispered through the grass, rattled the dry palm fronds beyond the wall, and carried the smell of salt and decay in equal measure. I stood beside the grave as they lowered him into the sand. A plain pine box, no decoration, no embellishment. The hole had been dug barely wide enough, the sides already beginning to crumble inward. The sea air had made the earth soft, the kind of soft that doesn't feel like earth at all, but something more transient, more temporary. As the last handfuls of sand hit the lid, the wind shifted, cold and sudden. The sun vanished behind a rolling swell of grey clouds, and the air thickened, heavy with the scent of brine and something else. Something older, darker, sour as iron. My skin prickled, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I told myself it was grief, or exhaustion, or the damp seeping through my clothes, but the feeling only deepened as the others began to drift away. When the last mourners left, I lingered, staring at the mound of sand, now smoothed over by the wind's gentle, indifferent hand. The cemetery emptied, but the sensation didn't fade. The graves around me, so many of them unmarked, seemed to lean closer, as if listening. The air pulsed with it. I left quickly, the sound of the sea crashing against the stones ringing in my ears long after I stepped back onto the street. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house felt colder than it should have, the walls thin as paper against the wind. The scent of salt and earth clung to my skin. Just past 3 a.m, I heard the sound. Faint at first, like the distant creak of wood under strain. Then the shuffle of sand, as if footsteps were crossing the yard outside, slow and measured. I lay frozen, heart pounding, listening as the steps moved past my window, pausing just beyond the thin curtain of glass. The air grew heavy, damp and cold, the same heavy stillness I had felt by the grave. I never opened the curtain. I couldn't. The next morning, I walked back to Guet and Dar alone. The streets were bright and busy, as if the world had already forgotten the funeral, but the sky remained heavy and colourless. When I reached the cemetery, the gate stood ajar, the hinges screeching softly in the wind. I followed the path back to my uncle's grave. The mound of earth had collapsed inward, the sand sunken and cracked, as though something had stirred beneath it. Small footprints dotted the edge of the grave, not human, not animal, the kind of marks that looked as if the sand had shifted on its own. The others would have called it natural. The sea air, the loose earth, the settling of the grave. But I knew better. I felt it in my bones. For the rest of my stay, the nights were never silent. The sound of shifting sand and soft, deliberate footsteps haunted the darkness, always stopping just outside my window. The scent of salt and decay drifted through the rooms, even in the heat of midday. Small things vanished. A ring, a photograph, an old rosary left on the dresser, gone without a trace, as if the house itself had grown hungry. On my last night in St. Louis, the air grew so heavy I could barely breathe. The walls seemed to close in, the sound of the waves distant and muffled, as if I were already buried beneath the sand. I lay awake until dawn, the unseen presence pressing against me like the weight of the earth itself. When I left the next morning, I avoided the cemetery. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. The road back to Dakar was long and flat, and the sea wind followed me, a constant reminder that some places never let you leave fully. Even now, back in France, I wake to the sound of shifting sand. The scent of salt sometimes drifts through my apartment, sharp and sudden, out of place and undeniable. I know it followed me. I know it's waiting. Because some graves don't hold the dead as tightly as we'd like to believe. And some ghosts, once they find you, never let you go.